December 7, 1941, 28 admirals stood ahead of him in seniority, and Franklin Roosevelt passed over every single one of them to hand a 56-year-old paper pusher the worst job in America. That Sunday morning, the man in question was eating breakfast with his wife in a quiet house in Washington, 4,000 miles from the catastrophe that was about to make him the most important commander in the United States. The radio murmured in the next room. The first reports came in fragmentary, half-believed, and then suddenly unmistakable. He set down his coffee and did not move for a long time. He had no idea that within 9 days the president would call him into a room and place the smoking ruin of the Pacific Fleet into his hands. His name was Chester Nimitz. And the strangest part of all is that this same man had once been court-martialed for running his very first ship aground. But to understand why Roosevelt reached so far down the list to find him, you have to begin where the whole country began that morning, with 353 Japanese aircraft falling out of the clouds above Pearl Harbor and discovering that nobody was looking up. At 7:55 in the morning, the first torpedo slammed into the USS Oklahoma. Then another, then more in rapid succession, at least 5 tearing into her hull. The battleship rolled onto her side like a wounded animal, and 429 men went down with her into the oil and the dark. Across the harbor on Battleship Row, the USS Arizona took a single armor-piercing bomb that punched down into her forward magazine. The explosion was so violent it lifted the entire front of the ship clean out of the water. 1,177 men died in less than 9 seconds, and most never knew what hit them. By 9 in the morning, it was over. 4 battleships rested on the bottom. A 5th lay beached and burning. 3 more were crippled. 188 aircraft were destroyed before they ever left the ground. 2,403 Americans were dead. The most powerful naval base in the entire Pacific had ceased to exist as a fighting force in under 2 hours. The man who commanded that fleet was in his office above the harbor when the attack began. Admiral Husband Kimmel was 59, a career sailor, meticulous and respected by the men beneath him. He watched his fleet die through the window of his office, and at one point a spent .50 caliber bullet smashed through the glass and struck him square in the chest. It bounced off, leaving a dark bruise on his white uniform. Kimmel bent down and picked the bullet up. He turned it over once in his palm, and he said quietly that it would have been merciful if it had killed him, because he already understood what was happening not just to the fleet, but to him. 10 days later, on December 17th, Admiral Kimmel was stripped of his command and reverted to his permanent 2-star rank. His career was finished. There would be 8 investigations in the years to come, and he would spend the rest of his life trying to clear his name and never succeed. But the truth was more complicated than the public wanted. Kimmel was not a fool and not a coward. He was, however, the commander who had failed to order long-range air patrols north of the island. The commander who kept his battleships clustered tight in the harbor like books on a shelf. The commander who read Washington's warning cables as warnings of sabotage on the ground rather than an attack from the sea. He made the decisions. The decisions were wrong, and the price was paid by other men. But Washington had no appetite for nuance. It needed a name to blame, and Kimmel's fit perfectly. The trouble was that Washington had a far more urgent problem than blame. Japan was advancing on every front at once. Wake Island was under siege, Guam had fallen, the Philippines were collapsing, the United States had just lost its entire Pacific Fleet, and the single most important military command in America had no leader at all. A temporary replacement stepped in, Vice Admiral William Pye, and his very first major decision would quietly destroy his career before it had even begun. A relief force was already steaming toward Wake Island, where a handful of Marines had been holding the atoll alone for 2 desperate weeks. Pye looked at the maps. He looked at his precious few remaining carriers. And he decided the risk was simply too great. He recalled the relief force when it was just 200 miles from the island. Wake fell to the Japanese on December 23rd, and Pye was quietly removed from any consideration for permanent command. His hesitation would haunt the Navy for the rest of the war, even before Wake fell. The Secretary of the Navy had flown to Hawaii to see the damage himself. Frank Knox was a former Rough Rider who had once ridden beside Theodore Roosevelt in Cuba, a newspaper publisher Franklin Roosevelt had placed in his cabinet for bipartisan cover. Knox walked through the wreckage. He saw bodies still being pulled from the oil. He stood in the burned-out hangars with his shoes turning black with soot, and he came back to the White House and told the president that the Pacific Fleet did not just need a new commander, it needed an entirely different kind of commander. So the question became, who? The list began with 28 names, all senior to the man Roosevelt would eventually choose. Each one was considered. Each one was set aside. The popular story afterward was that every senior admiral had refused the job, that command of Pearl Harbor had become a poisoned chalice no man would touch. But the truth was sharper. No one refused, because Roosevelt never gave them the chance. He passed them over himself one by one for reasons that had nothing to do with cowardice and everything to do with politics. This admiral had signed off on the pre-war Pacific deployment. That one had served as Kimmel's deputy. Another had pushed the policy of concentrating the fleet at Pearl Harbor in the first place. Every senior name carried a fingerprint on the disaster, and Roosevelt was hunting for a man with no fingerprints at all. The man whose name kept rising to the top was not what anyone expected. Chester William Nimitz was 56 years old, a rear admiral, 2 stars and no more. He ran the Bureau of Navigation, which despite the name was not about navigation at all. It was the personnel office of the entire United States Navy. He decided where officers were stationed, approved promotions, shuffled men around a board day after day in a quiet Washington building. He was no surface warfare hero. He had never led a carrier task force, never commanded a battle squadron in combat. He was a submarine man and a diesel engineer, a Texan from a tiny hill country town called Fredericksburg, whose grandfather had been a German sea captain who settled in the most landlocked corner of Texas and built a hotel shaped like a ship because he missed the ocean he would never see again. By almost every conventional measure, Chester Nimitz was the wrong man for the job, but Roosevelt saw something the rest of the Navy did not. And here is the detail that turns the whole thing on its head. 11 months before the attack, back in January of 1941, Roosevelt had already quietly offered Nimitz command of the Pacific Fleet, and Nimitz had turned it down. He told the president he was too junior, that the men senior to him would resent the leapfrog, that it would poison morale for years. He thanked the president, went back to his desk, and kept signing personnel papers. It was a refusal that, 11 months later, looked less like humility and more like fate. Because if Nimitz had said yes in January, then on the morning of December 7th, it would have been his fleet in that harbor, his battleships on the bottom, his name nailed to the disaster. His career finished alongside Kimmel's. Instead, by chance, by one quiet refusal, on the morning of the attack his name was nowhere on the cables flooding into Washington. But there was one more thing about Chester Nimitz the public did not know. One detail buried in his record that, if it ever came out, would have ended any chance he had of leading the Pacific Fleet. In May of 1908, a 23-year-old ensign named Chester Nimitz was given command of his very first vessel, a small destroyer in the Asiatic Fleet. He had been out of the academy 3 years and had never commanded a ship before. 2 months later, he ran that destroyer hard aground on a mudbank in a Philippine harbor. He was court-martialed, found guilty of neglect of duty, and given a letter of reprimand, the lightest punishment available. But the conviction never came off his record. And 33 years later, as his name circulated as the possible savior of the Pacific Fleet, it was still sitting there, buried in the personnel files of the very Bureau of Navigation that Nimitz himself now ran. The man being considered to rescue the Navy from the worst defeat in its history had once been convicted of wrecking his own first ship. On the morning of December 16th, 9 days after the attack, and 1 day before Kimmel's relief would be made public, Rear Admiral Nimitz was at his desk when a message arrived. The Secretary of the Navy wanted to see him immediately. He walked down the corridor in his blue uniform, quiet as always, while the hallway churned with men moving too fast and speaking too loudly. The country was 9 days into a war, and the building had not yet learned how to be calm. He stepped into Frank Knox's office, and Knox did not ease into it. The Pacific Fleet needed a new commander, he said. The president had chosen him, effective immediately. Nimitz said nothing for a moment. He was 56 years old, a man who had spent his entire career being passed over for the dramatic commands, the celebrated posts, the names everyone knew. He had turned down this exact job 11 months earlier because he thought he was not ready. Now there was no one else. He looked at Knox, and he asked a single question. He asked when he should leave. The train pulled out of Union Station at 5 in the afternoon on December 19th, and Chester Nimitz was not wearing a uniform. The president had ordered him to travel in civilian clothes because the country was still in shock and the newspapers were hunting for a face to celebrate. Roosevelt did not want that face unveiled on a railway platform. He wanted Nimitz to arrive at Pearl Harbor the way a doctor arrives quietly at a bedside, without warning, before anyone has time to argue. So Nimitz boarded the train in a gray suit and a dark hat, carrying a small leather suitcase. His wife Catherine saw him off without tears. They had been married 30 years. She knew exactly what this was. It was a 4-day journey across a country that had just learned what war meant, and the news that reached him at every stop grew worse. Wake Island had fallen. Manila was being bombed. The British battleships Prince of Wales and Repulse had been sunk off Malaya by Japanese aircraft in open ocean in a single afternoon. The proudest navy in the world had just lost 2 capital ships to airplanes, and the lesson was written in plain letters across the water. The age of the battleship was over, and Chester Nimitz was riding west to take command of a fleet that did not yet understand that. He reached San Diego on Christmas Eve and boarded a flying boat for the final leg, turning west toward Hawaii. He arrived at 7 in the morning on Christmas Day, 1941, and stepped off onto a dock still slick with fuel oil, still in his civilian suit. The harbor in front of him was a graveyard. The masts of sunken battleships stuck out of the water at angles no naval architect had ever drawn. The hull of the Oklahoma floated upside down like a dead whale. The Arizona was simply gone. The water was black with oil and gray with ash, and every time the wind shifted, the smell of fuel and burnt steel and burnt men rolled across the dock. 18 days after the attack, the harbor was still burning in places. Nimitz looked at it for a long time. A car was waiting, and a young lieutenant held the door, a man who had not slept in 2 days and was not sure whether to salute someone in civilian clothes. Nimitz took off his hat, got in, and said nothing during the drive. But what he saw along the harbor road was not what the photographs would later show. The newsreels would show the broken battleships, the fire, the wreckage. The country would be told again and again what had been lost at Pearl Harbor. And Chester Nimitz, alone in the back of that car on Christmas morning, was one of the only men in America looking at what had not been lost. Because the Japanese had made a catastrophic mistake and almost no one had noticed yet. A quarter mile from Battleship Row stood the fuel tank farm. 4.5 million barrels of oil, enough to run the entire Pacific Fleet for a year and a half. The Japanese pilots had photographs of those tanks, and they did not drop a single bomb on them. The submarine base, with its piers and workshops and torpedo storage, stood completely untouched. 22 American submarines were based there, and not one was hit. Within months, those submarines would begin a campaign against Japanese shipping that would eventually strangle the home islands of Japan itself. The dry docks were intact. The machine shops, the cranes, the repair yards, everything the Navy would need to raise the battleships off the harbor floor and rebuild them, all of it survived. And the most important ships of all were not even there. Every single aircraft carrier in the Pacific Fleet had been at sea on the morning of December 7th. One returning from Wake Island, one steaming toward Midway, one on the west coast taking on a new air group. Not one was in the harbor when the bombs fell. The Japanese had sunk an old navy, a navy of battleships, the navy of the last war. They had not laid a finger on the new one. This was what Nimitz saw on that dock, what no one else had seen, because everyone else was busy counting the dead. 6 days later, on the last day of 1941, the change of command ceremony was held. In any normal time it would have taken place on the deck of a battleship, the proud flagship of the fleet. But there were no battleships left to stand on. So they held it on the deck of a submarine, the US Grayling, low and narrow in the water, with a cold December rain blowing across her hull. The crew stood at attention on the wet steel. The new commander climbed onto the conning tower and turned to face them, now Admiral Chester Nimitz, 4 stars, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet. He read his orders aloud in a flat, quiet voice. No speech. No promise of vengeance. He saluted the men, climbed down, and it was over in 7 minutes. A submarine officer, taking command of a fleet destroyed by airplanes, from the deck of a submarine, because the surface ships were all on the bottom of the harbor. It would become one of the most quietly devastating images of the entire Pacific War. And his very first command decision, made within hours of taking the colors, would stun Washington. The staff officers who had served under Kimmel were still at their desks, expecting to be relieved. There was the intelligence officer, a Japanese linguist who had spent nearly 2 years as a naval attaché in Tokyo before the war, and the war plans officer. Known throughout the Navy as Socrates for his habit of arguing through any problem out loud, they had packed their bags, the fleet had been destroyed on their watch, the country wanted someone to pay, and they assumed they were next. Nimitz called them into his office on the first morning of the new year, and he told them, in plain words, that any man who wanted a transfer would have his full support and a glowing recommendation, but he hoped none of them would leave. They knew this theater, they knew this enemy, they knew what had happened on December 7th in a way no one Washington could send out ever would. He needed them. Every single one of them stayed. When the news reached Frank Knox, the Secretary of the Navy is said to have set down his pen and stared at the wall for a long moment. The country was screaming for blood, and Nimitz had just refused to give them any. It was a decision that, if it had gone wrong, would have destroyed him, and the men he had spared would do one more thing for him, something he needed more than anything. They would take him down into a basement and introduce him to the strangest officer in the United States Navy. The basement was beneath the headquarters building at Pearl Harbor, no windows, the lights buzzed day and night, and the air reeked of cigarette smoke, stale coffee, and unwashed bodies, because the men who worked there did not leave often enough to bathe. This was Station Hypo, the combat intelligence unit, the codebreakers, and the man who ran it was one of the most eccentric officers in the Navy. He worked in a red velvet smoking jacket and carpet slippers. He had not seen the sun in 3 weeks. He kept a card index of every Japanese radio call sign his unit had ever intercepted going back 5 years and could recite any of them from memory. He spoke Japanese. He drank coffee until his hands shook. He once forgot to go home for 4 straight days. He and his team were working on the Japanese Imperial Navy's main operational code, one of the most secure ciphers in the world. They had cracked perhaps 15% of it, and 15%, it would turn out, was enough. Nimitz came down into that basement in early January, a new 4-star admiral in a crisp uniform, descending into a smoke-filled room of men in bathrobes. He shook the codebreaker's hand, said simply that he had heard good things, then stayed for an hour and listened. What he decided in that single hour would shape the entire course of the Pacific War. He decided to believe this strange man in the basement, and that sounds like nothing. It was everything. Because 3,000 miles away in Washington there was a rival code-breaking unit, run by 2 well-connected brothers who had the ear of the most powerful admiral in the Navy. They were certain their own reading of Japanese intentions was superior. The man in the Pearl Harbor basement outranked neither of them and refused to defer to either, and the fight between Washington and Hawaii over what the Japanese would do next would become the bitterest intelligence dispute of the war. Nimitz had just placed his trust and his career in the hands of the man Washington was determined to overrule. And he needed every scrap of that intelligence, because through the first 4 months of 1942, the war was a catastrophe with no bottom. The Japanese swept through the Southwest Pacific almost unopposed. The Dutch East Indies fell. Singapore surrendered. The worst defeat in British military history. Burma collapsed. In the Philippines, the American garrison was forced to abandon its position, and thousands began a death march into captivity. Nimitz was fighting a holding action with 3 aircraft carriers and almost nothing else. He sent them out on raids that accomplished little in military terms, but did the one thing he needed. They reminded the American people that the Pacific Fleet still existed. They bought time. Then, in April, 16 American bombers launched off the deck of a carrier and struck Tokyo itself. The physical damage was minimal, but the blow to the pride of the Japanese high command was enormous. The admiral who had planned the attack on Pearl Harbor was humiliated, and he resolved that the American carriers had to be hunted down and destroyed before they could ever do it again. He began planning a single, decisive battle in the Central Pacific, designed to lure the last American carriers into the open and annihilate them. His target was a tiny atoll called Midway, but before that trap was sprung, the 2 navies collided once already. In early May, 2 of Nimitz's carriers met a Japanese task force in the Coral Sea. It was the first naval battle in history fought entirely by aircraft, 2 fleets that never once saw each other. One American carrier was sunk, the other, the Yorktown, took a heavy bomb that punched deep inside her hull and started fires across 4 decks. She limped back to Pearl Harbor trailing oil, and when she crawled into dry dock at the end of May. The shipyard inspectors walked her broken interior and came back to Nimitz with a verdict. 3 months. 90 days of full effort work to make her battle ready. There was no faster way. Nimitz read the report and did not argue. He went down to the dry dock himself in his khaki uniform and walked the same scorched decks the inspectors had walked. He looked at the buckled steel. Then he turned to the chief of the shipyard and told him the truth. They did not have 90 days, they had 72 hours. What happened next was almost beyond belief. The shipyard worked around the clock. Welders were pulled off every other job in the yard. Floodlights were rigged over the dry dock. 1,400 men ate at their stations and slept on the deck plates when they slept at all. They patched the holes, reinforced the bulkheads, restored the boilers. They did in 3 days what the inspectors had sworn could not be done in 90. On May 30th, the Yorktown sailed out under her own power, a stripe of welder's sparks still trailing down her flank. Bound for a battle Washington did not even believe was coming, because Washington still did not believe the man in the basement. The rival codebreakers had told the powerful Admiral there that the next offensive would strike the American West Coast, or the Aleutians, or perhaps Hawaii itself. They were quite certain it would not be Midway. But the team in the basement had been intercepting dozens of references to a target the Japanese simply called AF, and the man who ran the basement was convinced AF was Midway, so he set a trap. He had the garrison on Midway transmit a message in plain language on an open frequency reporting that the island's freshwater plant had broken down. Then he waited. 48 hours later, a Japanese station relayed a coded message back to Tokyo reporting that AF was short of fresh water. AF was Midway. He carried the decoded intercept straight to Nimitz. Nimitz read it, looked up, and asked the codebreaker how confident he was. The man said he would stake his career on it. Nimitz told him quietly that they were both already staking their careers on it. And then he gave the order. Every available carrier, every escort, every aircraft, every submarine, every ship that could still steam, was to position itself northeast of Midway and lie in ambush. The hunters were about to walk straight into a trap they did not know existed, set by a man they had dismissed on the strength of a code only 15% broken. And the only thing left to decide was who would command the carriers when the two fleets finally met. The man who was supposed to command the carriers was the most aggressive carrier officer in the entire Navy, a fighter by instinct. But he had returned from months of unbroken combat covered head to toe in a savage rash, unable to sleep, unable to eat, barely able to stand. The doctors ordered him into a hospital bed for at least a month. And from that bed, in real pain, he gave Nimitz the most important recommendation of the war. He told him to give the carriers to a quiet cruiser commander named Raymond Spruance. Spruance was 55. He had never commanded an aircraft carrier in his life, never run a carrier air group. He was a surface gunnery officer, thin, cold, intellectual. The exact opposite of the firebrand who was handing him the job, and Nimitz agreed on the spot. So in the days that followed, as the Pacific Fleet steamed toward its rendezvous point northeast of Midway, the entire weight of the United States Navy rested on 3 men. Nimitz, who had bet his career on a codebreaker in a basement. The codebreaker, who had bet his career on the difference between 2 letters in a Japanese codebook. And Spruance, who had bet his career on a job he had never done before, handed to him by a friend in a hospital gown. The Japanese fleet was already at sea. 4 fleet carriers, 7 battleships, more than 200 aircraft, 20,000 men. Their admiral believed the Americans had at most 2 carriers left operational in the entire Pacific. He was wrong. Nimitz had 3. The night before the battle was silent. The American carriers steamed in formation under a starless sky 200 miles northeast of Midway. The crews had been told what was coming, that the Japanese had 4 carriers and the Americans 3. And that everything depended on the next 48 hours. In his cabin aboard the flagship, Spruance slept 4 hours. The men under his command included some of the most experienced naval aviators in the world. He was not one of them. The man who should have been in that cabin was in a hospital bed in Hawaii, and the man who had put him there was 3,000 miles away at Pearl Harbor, waiting for word. Spruance woke at 4 in the morning on June 4, 1942. By dawn, the American search planes were airborne, and at 34 minutes past 5, a patrol plane northwest of Midway broke radio silence with 2 words. Many planes. Minutes later, a second message. 2 carriers, then a third, on a heading straight for the island. The enemy fleet had been found, exactly where the man in the basement had said it would be. The Japanese strike hit Midway at 6:30 in the morning. The Marine garrison threw everything it had into the air, and the obsolete American fighters were shot out of the sky in minutes. 25 went up, 10 came back, most 2 shot through to ever fly again. And then the Japanese carriers, having battered the island, turned to recover their planes and rearm them for a second strike. This was the moment. Spruance launched everything he had, every torpedo bomber, every dive bomber, every fighter the carriers could put into the air. The first American squadron to find the enemy fleet was a torpedo squadron of 15 slow, obsolete torpedo bombers. They went in with no fighter escort at all. Their commander had told his men the night before that some of them were not coming back, and that they should do their best anyway. He was right on both counts. All 15 of his aircraft were shot down. Of the 30 men in them, 29 died in the water. 1 survived, clinging to a floating seat cushion. And from there he watched the rest of the greatest naval battle of the war unfold around him. A second torpedo squadron came in next. Of 14 aircraft, 10 were shot down. A third followed. Of 12, 10 were shot down. In less than an hour, the American torpedo bombers had been almost completely annihilated, and not a single one of their torpedoes had found a target. But they had not died for nothing. To slaughter them, the Japanese fighters had dropped down to sea level, chasing the last of the torpedo planes across the waves. The sky above the Japanese carriers was suddenly, fatally empty, and that was the exact moment the American dive bombers arrived. The commander of the dive bombers from one carrier had been searching for the enemy for over an hour, running dangerously low on fuel, about to turn for home, when he spotted far below him the wake of a single Japanese destroyer racing northeast at full speed. He gambled that it was hurrying to rejoin the main fleet. He followed it, and it led him straight to the carriers. His dive bombers came screaming down out of the sun from 12,000 feet. And at almost the exact same instant, by accident or by something else, the dive bombers from another American carrier came plunging in from the opposite direction. The Japanese carriers were caught at the worst possible moment, their flight decks crowded with fueled and armed aircraft, ordnance stacked loose on the decks, fuel hoses snaking everywhere, their fighters all down at sea level. In a window of less than 10 minutes, the entire war in the Pacific turned over. One bomb went through a flight deck into the hangar below, where armed planes were waiting, and the carrier erupted from the inside. Within minutes, she was a torch, 1,000 feet long. A second carrier was pulverized, 3 direct hits, burning from end to end. A third was hammered into a blazing wreck. 3 of Japan's fleet carriers, 3 of the 6 ships that had struck Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier, all on fire and dying in less time than it takes to describe it. The 4th Japanese carrier, some miles to the north, was still untouched, and she launched everything she had. Her aircraft found the Yorktown, the same ship the shipyard at Pearl had patched together in 72 hours. The ship that should not have been at Midway at all. They put 3 bombs into her and stopped her dead in the water. Hours later, a second strike came in low and drove 2 torpedoes into her side. She listed hard, and the order was given to abandon ship. The Yorktown was dying for the second time in a month, but late that afternoon, the surviving American dive bombers found the 4th carrier and put her to the torch as well. By dawn the next morning, her own crew sent her to the bottom, 4 Japanese fleet carriers in a single day. Japan would eventually replace the ships. She would never replace the men. The pilots who died at Midway were the most experienced naval aviators in the Japanese Navy, irreplaceable veterans. And the rigid Japanese training pipeline could never produce their equals fast enough. From that morning forward, the strategic initiative in the Pacific belonged permanently to the United States. The Yorktown herself was still afloat 2 days later, and a skeleton crew had reboarded her to try to save her when a Japanese submarine slipped through the destroyer screen and put 2 torpedoes into her side. She finally rolled over and sank at dawn. The price of Midway, on the American side, was that 1 carrier, 1 destroyer, and a few hundred men. Nimitz read the dispatches as they came in. He did not celebrate. He wrote condolence letters to the families of the men killed under his command, some of the names in his own hand. The country wanted a parade. Nimitz wrote letters, and in Washington, the admirals who had called him a desk clerk went very quiet. And then came the part of the story almost no one has ever told. 4 months after the most decisive naval victory in American history, the codebreaker who had made it possible, the strange man in the basement who had found the Japanese fleet, was quietly relieved of his command. The rival brothers in Washington, the ones who had been wrong about everything, persuaded the powerful Admiral that code-breaking should be centralized under their control. The man who won Midway had no powerful friends and had never played the political game. He was reassigned to command a floating dry dock in San Francisco Bay, a facility for repairing damaged hulls. Nimitz protested in writing twice and was overruled. The codebreaker accepted it without complaint and ran that dry dock for the rest of the war. He was recommended for the nation's high honors twice, and both recommendations were buried. He died in 1976 in a small house in California, never recognized in his lifetime for what he had done in that basement. The medal was finally handed to his family 10 years after his death by a president in 1986. That is what the Pacific War did to some of the men who won it. The war itself ground on for 3 more years, and Nimitz commanded every major operation of it, island after bloody island, all the way to the edge of Japan. By the end of 1944, his Pacific Fleet was the largest naval force ever assembled by any nation in human history. Thousands of ships, tens of thousands of aircraft, millions of men and women in uniform. He never gave a speech for the newsreels. He never posed for the cameras. He wrote letters home to his wife every week in the same quiet, careful handwriting he had used all his life. In December of 1944, he was promoted to Fleet Admiral, 5 stars, a rank held in the entire history of the Navy by only a handful of men. And on the morning of September 2, 1945, a battleship lay at anchor in Tokyo Bay, the USS Missouri, with the instruments of surrender laid out on a small table on her deck. Chester Nimitz stepped forward, 60 years old, 5 stars on his collar, and signed for the United States of America in the same flat, neat hand he had used his whole life. The man who had taken command of the Pacific Fleet on the deck of a submarine, because there were no battleships left, ended the war on the deck of a battleship, because there was no enemy left. And in the years afterward, when interviewers came to ask him about Pearl Harbor, his answer was never what they expected. He told them it had been a mercy. If the fleet had not been in the harbor that morning, if Kimmel had known the Japanese were coming, he would have sailed out to meet them in open ocean, and there the battleships would have been caught, slower than the Japanese carriers, without air cover, against an enemy that had already proven what aircraft could do to a battleship in deep water. They would have been sunk in waters 2,000 fathoms deep, and tens of thousands of men would have drowned. Instead, at Pearl Harbor, the water was shallow. The men were pulled out. 6 of the 8 battleships sunk that day were eventually raised, repaired, and sent back to sea, and some of them were anchored in Tokyo Bay on the morning of the surrender. The disaster that destroyed one navy had created the conditions for the navy that won the war. The quiet Texan, who took command from the deck of a submarine, the man 28 admirals were passed over to find, saw it more clearly than anyone. Whether any other man would have seen it, standing alone on that oil-slicked dock on Christmas morning while the harbor still burned, is a question with no answer at all.